Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, Paint Mind Studio. My name is Diana, and in today's video, I will be sharing with you my top 5 tips that will help improve your ink drawing skills. If this is what you've been looking for, then this video is for you. And make sure to stick around to the end to catch my bonus tip, the one that will instantly elevate all of your drawings, not just the ones done in ink. So grab your favorite sketching supplies, get comfortable, and let's start drawing. All right, guys, so we are jumping right in. Without any further preamble, I am going to give you the first tip that I think is important because you've probably heard me say this before if you've watched any of my videos before. So first tip, focus on forms and shapes. When you start your drawing, whatever it is, I think it's important to start with what you're looking at. You want to get down on that paper, whatever it is that you're looking at, and get down those shapes and those forms so that everything that comes after that is going to be easier for you. For this particular picture, I started with the rocks because they're in the foreground and I can start right at the bottom with them and work my way up. So I'm getting those big shapes down, those little shapes down, and it just makes it makes the process proceed more smoothly once you get all that down, because technically that is going to be a little bit of the harder part, especially if you're not used to drawing very much. It can be a little intimidating to look at something and be like, how am I going to draw that, right? So focus on the big shapes, on the outline, and that's why whenever I'm doing an illustration, it tends to look like a coloring page at first because I haven't done any of the shading yet. I'm not worried about the dark lines just yet or giving it depth just yet because I am making sure first that I'm drawing it to the best of my ability so that it looks like what I'm looking at, right? So get all that down first, and the more practice you gain with it, then you can start mixing and matching techniques. But I recommend that you start with the shapes and the forms first. And the second tip is going to be probably the most important as far as drawing something like this is concerned, or if you're drawing architecture, and that's going to be perspective and proportion. You really want to make sure that you get that correct. You might have noticed in the video that I was kind of hovering my pen over the paper without really making any marks because I was visualizing the angle of that bridge. That bridge is, the perspective is not something that I want to get wrong because it's right in the middle of the image. So your eye is automatically going to be drawn to that. It's going to be a focal point. So you want to make sure that the perspective is correct. And when I draw all those little arches, the big arches, the middle arches, the little arches, everything, all those curves, I want to make sure that they're also in the correct perspective. So if the bridge, the right side is angled further down and the left side is angled further up, then I want to make sure that the top of my arches are also angled accordingly in the same way because it all plays into perspective. So you want to get that right. Perspective is something that you really want to practice a lot so that when you're looking at something, you have more confidence in trusting what you see. You have to trust what you see because your mind will play tricks on you. If the angle is very extreme, like in this image, for instance, the perspective is extreme. The angles, eventually, as we get to the castle, they become extremely angled. So you want to trust what you see. Also, the proportion. You want to work on proportion. Make sure that the proportion is correct because you don't want to draw something too small or too big, because that's going to jump out at you. That's going to jump out at the viewer when they look at something. They're going to be like, there's something not quite right about this picture. What is wrong with it? And if what you're drawing is not the right size, then nothing is going to fall into place right. And especially when you're doing freehand drawing like this, freeform drawing directly with ink where you can't erase anything, then if you don't get the size right, then everything else that you draw after that is also not going to be the right size. So you really want to pay attention to that, to perspective and proportion. They work in junction. They work together. You can't really have one without the other when you're drawing something big, when you're drawing something that has a lot of detail. You can get away with it a little bit more if you're doing, of course, something simpler, but it is a skill that you do want to practice and get down. It's part of the fundamentals of drawing. It's not really something that you want to skip. You want to practice that as much as you can until you're satisfied with it, until what you're looking at looks right. And that leads me into my next tip, which is tip number 3, and that is going to be line variation. Line variation to make your image look more dynamic, more characteristic. If you want to show your style more of how you draw, then you want to vary your lines. You don't want to just use the same thickness of line. You want to use thicker lines, thinner lines. It will help you add texture and direction and style, of course. You also need to vary your line weight. Varying your line weight is also going to give you line variation. And this is going to just help liven up your drawing. It's going to help with depth. It's going to help your image not look flat. That's always something that artists are striving to avoid, is that whatever it is they're working at does not look flat, because it can be tricky to, of course, draw something that you're looking at that's two-dimensional and you're trying to render it in a three-dimensional way. And one of the best and really easiest ways to do that is just to vary your lines. And you see me doing that a lot in the video here. The right side here of this castle is a challenge because the perspective is so extreme. The angles are so sharp, and it gets tricky. So you do have to practice that. You have to make sure that you know how to get those thick lines, how to get those thin lines, and where to put them. You know, you have to trust your eyes, trust what you see, trust where you see the shadows, things of that nature, right? So varying your lines is going to help to ease that. And you don't have to be so detailed about it. I know that it doesn't look like it when you look at me drawing this thing. I'm adding all these little details, but a lot of it is really just implied. Like when I draw the brickwork on the castle walls, I'm not drawing every single little brick. I mean, that's just going to take forever. So I'm just drawing some lines across, some choppy lines across, and then adding some vertical choppy lines, horizontal choppy lines, and vertical choppy lines to indicate the brickwork. And, you know, it works. When you look at it, you can see that it's made up of some type of stone brick, right? Some type of a brick structure. So you don't have to be extremely detailed about everything. A lot of it is actually implied, and your line variation is really going to help with that. You can see here in the video that I'm just really working with the lines. I'm thickening up lines, I'm thinning some lines, and you also want to use like flick motions too, to just make it all more lively, to give it all a lively quality when you're drawing freehand with ink. There on the top right corner, I actually ended up making a little bit of a mistake because my line, the initial line that I drew that goes all the way up, it's not supposed to go all the way up, as you can see. There's an end to it, and there's another tower, two other towers, and they're angled. So I ended up correcting that with line variation. That's where that comes in handy as well. My next tip for you is going to be shading. Shading is as equally important in my mind as perspective and proportion, because this is what's going to really give your image depth. This is what's really going to make your image look the most dynamic. If you don't do your shading in a way that makes sense, then it's not going to look right? So when you look at whatever it is that you're drawing, or if you're working with an image such as this one like I am, then you want to see where these shadows are. And the way that I do shading is by scribbling. And you might think like scribbles, isn't that what kids do? Well, yeah, kids do that too, but it is actually a technical term for drawing. Scribbling is a quick way to get shading down on an image. And it's also a way to develop a style. Everybody kind of scribbles differently. And I don't know if that's something that's innate from childhood or from just the way that you end up practicing things. I don't know. But that's how I do it. I do rely a lot on scribbling, especially on the castle walls, because I want to differentiate that from the shading on the rocks that comes later on in the picture. So I am relying heavily. And with shading, you also want to do something that's called contour shading. And I mentioned this briefly in a previous video, in my first video, the church one that involves drawing directly with ink. You do want to do contour shading. You want to follow the shape of the object that you're shading. So the roofs on the castle here, they're triangular, yeah, but they're also cylindrical. So they do have a curve to them. So when you add shading to something like that, you do want to follow that curve. It'll make it look more realistic that way. And it'll help the viewer see that this shape is cylindrical, right? So contour shading, scribble shading. And also, tip number 5, you want to know your tools. You need to familiarize yourself with whatever it is that you're using so that you know what tool is going to give you those lines. What tool is going to give you the best line variation? What tool is going to help you with the shading? You want to know what your tools can do for you. If you're going to do something like this with fine liners, for instance, where you have different gradients, you have different levels on the point. You have, for instance, 0.005, 0.01, 0.05, 0.08, whatever it is that you're using. You do want to be very familiar with those tools and know what size point is going to give you what size line. And that's why I enjoy using the fountain pen so much, because I can get some automatic line variation just with the nib of the fountain pen. You can also get all of that with a pencil. Whatever it is that you're using, whatever paper you're using, whatever pen or pencil or marker, whatever you're using, you want to know how those tools work for you. And that's going to help you work more efficiently, because you can draw with anything. You can make lines and marks with anything. But if you don't know what kind of a mark that specific tool is going to give you, then you're going to work slower, you're going to make more mistakes, and you're just going to get frustrated with yourself. So I recommend that you really, really know your tools. And if you're using something new, then practice, just do some warm-ups with those tools. I do that all the time before I start drawing a big picture. I get some scrap paper, I grab my tools, and I just draw random things just to kind of refamiliarize myself with what I can do with that pen, for instance, if it's a pen that I haven't used in a while. So definitely do warm-ups before you jump into the actual piece that you're working on so that you'll work more efficiently, make less mistakes, okay? So that you don't get upset with yourself, so that at the end, when you're done drawing what you're drawing, you'll be more satisfied. You'll feel more accomplished. If you keep having to pause and be like, oh, I didn't mean to do that line, it's probably because you just weren't sure how to use that tool. It's going to help you draw better. And my bonus tip, which is a fun one, involves hatching and cross-hatching. Now, cross-hatching and hatching is a very, very common drawing technique. A lot of artists rely on that for shading because it's efficient. It is efficient, and it looks good at the end if you do it right. Hatching is when you just do lines in one direction, vertical, horizontally, diagonally, whatever, in one direction without crossing lines, right? And then cross-hatching is when you use another set of lines across the first set of lines. So my bonus tip for you is when you do that, if you are doing hatching or cross-hatching with whatever you're using, pencil, pen, whatever, do it on the diagonal. If you do it on the diagonal, your image is going to look more put together. It's going to look more sophisticated, and it's going to look less beginner-like. So I recommend that you do it on the diagonal. So draw your lines in, for instance, a 40-degree angle instead of 90 degrees. Instead of straight up vertical lines and instead of straight across horizontal lines, do it on the diagonal. So visualize yourself creating diamonds with your cross-hatching instead of squares. And if you're just doing hatching, not crossing lines, then do it at an angle. It'll look prettier. It'll make your drawing look that much better right away, automatically. You also want to keep those lines together when you're doing not together, but as close as possible and even. When you're doing your hatching and cross-hatching, you want to keep those lines even. And also, along the same lines of line variation, vary the length of your lines. And I'm doing that very heavily here on the rocks because I want them to stand out separately from the way that I shaded the castle, because they're two separate things. They're two separate objects, right? So I'm doing a lot of hatching and varying my lengths in those hatching marks to indicate the indents in the rocks, for instance, the shadows, of course, but the lighter shadows. And then the darker shadows, I'm relying heavily on cross-hatching as well as solid areas. Like wherever the deepest shadows are, I'm filling those areas in right away. And at the beginning, I took the time to draw out all those guidelines on the rocks. And I'm happy I did, because when I got to the shading at the end here, it made it that much easier just to fill in those areas, to fill in the darker shadows full of ink, and then the cross-hatching for those mid-tones and the normal one-directional hatchings for the light tones. So that's it. Those are my 5 tips, plus the extra important bonus tip that I hope all of those were helpful to you. This is the finished piece. I'm happy with it. What do you think? How does it look to you? If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to answer your questions. And yeah, thanks for watching. And before I go, I'm going to give you a close-up of the end result so that you can see all my marks, all of my wonderful, lovely scribbles, which I rely on so much, the cross-hatching and the hatching, the contour shading, all of it. And that's it, guys. That's the end. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.